The city skyline bled a million pinpricks of light through the floor to ceiling windows, a silent, glittering audience to the scene unfolding on the Egyptian cotton sheets. From this height, in Arthur Sterling's penthouse, the world below seemed insignificant, a distant map of someone else's life. Eleanor felt the coolness of the silk against her bare back, a stark contrast to the oppressive warmth of the body beside her, the body on top of her. Each movement was precise, practiced, a rhythm of power and possession that had nothing to do with passion. Her gaze was fixed on a silver picture frame on the nightstand, the reflection of the city lights distorting the faces within. It was easier to focus on that, on the cold, hard edges of the frame, than on the hand gripping her shoulder, the scent of expensive whiskey on his breath. A sound escaped her lips, caught somewhere between a gasp and a sigh. "Arthur, please." The words hung in the air, a perfect little tragedy of ambiguity. A plea to stop, or a plea for more, it didn't matter. He would hear what he wanted to hear. Her mind, however, was a fortress of cold calculation. "This is the price," she told herself, her internal voice steady and clear even as her body trembled. This is the final interview. The vice president's office on the 48th floor had a view almost as good as this one. She had clawed her way up for 12 years, sacrificed weekends, friendships, the soft, easy comfort of a life lived without this gnawing, relentless ambition. She would not falter now, not when the prize was so close she could taste it. It was just a transaction, a signature on an unspoken contract. He moved with a final, guttural sigh, and the weight lifted. The silence that followed was somehow heavier. She didn't move, just listened to the sound of his breathing evening out, the distant siren wailing its lonely song 20 stories below. This feeling, this hollow echo inside her chest, was just a temporary side effect. It had to be. 3 months earlier, that feeling had been just a tiny seed of discontent. Eleanor Vance, marketing director at Sterling Corp., was a shark in a tailored suit, the sharpest mind in any boardroom she entered. She was brilliant, respected, and permanently stuck, watching less competent men ascend to the roles she deserved. The glass ceiling wasn't just visible, it was a thick, unyielding barrier she bruised herself against daily, and she was beginning to realize that talent and hard work were no longer enough to break it. She needed a different key, a different kind of leverage, and she was starting to understand that the only person who held it was the man who owned the entire building. The presentation was a masterpiece, a symphony of data and narrative that Eleanor had conducted with flawless precision. She stood before the board of Sterling Corp., a sleek figure in a graphite gray dress, her voice a calm, confident instrument weaving a vision of the future. The project, codenamed Odyssey, was her brainchild, a bold, multi-platform marketing initiative designed to launch the company into a new stratosphere of brand recognition. As she delivered her closing remarks, the numbers on the screen behind her glowing like constellations of profit, she could feel the victory in the room. She saw it in the impressed, slightly envious glances of her peers, in the slow, deliberate nods of the board members, and most importantly, in the unreadable but focused gaze of Arthur Sterling, seated at the head of the long mahogany table. She had done it. This presentation was the final, undeniable argument for her promotion to Vice President of Marketing. The position had been sitting vacant for 2 months, a silent throne she had been circling, preparing for, earning with every 16-hour workday and every sacrificed weekend. The applause was a satisfying, crisp sound in the climate-controlled air, but the victory soured just hours later. It wasn't a public defeat, nothing so crude. It was a quiet, corporate assassination delivered via an inter-office memo. The board had decided to postpone the restructuring of the marketing division pending further review. It was a lie, and Eleanor knew it. It was a stall, a way of saying no without saying no. She sat in her glass-walled office, the memo glowing on her screen, and felt a cold, familiar fury coiling in her gut. She had played their game, followed their rules, and exceeded every single metric they had set for her. Yet still, the gate remained closed. She maintained her composure, answering emails with professional grace, her face a serene mask while a storm raged within her. The summons came at 7 p.m., long after most of the floor had emptied out, leaving only the hum of servers and the distant moan of the cleaning crew's vacuum. An email from Arthur Sterling's executive assistant, polite and sterile. Mr. Sterling would like to see you in his office at your earliest convenience. His office was on the 50th floor, a sprawling expanse of chrome, leather, and glass that seemed to hang in the night sky. The city was a carpet of jewels at his feet. Arthur stood by the window, a silhouette against the metropolis, his back to her as she entered. He didn't turn around immediately, letting the silence stretch, a subtle exercise in power. "Eleanor," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "A magnificent presentation today. Truly." He turned, a faint smile on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes, the color of faded denim, assessed her with an intensity that went beyond professional appreciation. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her own voice perfectly level. "I was disappointed to hear about the board's decision to postpone the restructuring." He gestured to one of the leather armchairs opposite his massive desk, a silent command to sit. He remained standing, moving to his bar to pour 2 glasses of what looked like single malt scotch. "The board is cautious, Eleanor. It's a collection of old men who fear change, but I am not the board." He handed her a glass, his fingers brushing against hers for a fraction of a second too long. The contact was like a low-voltage electric shock. "The air is thin at the top of this company," he continued, walking back to stand near her chair, forcing her to look up at him. "Skill, talent, those things get you to where you are now. They get you a seat at the table, but they don't get you the chair at the head of it." He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "For that, you need something more. You need absolute trust, absolute loyalty, a commitment that transcends the hours of 9 to 5. Every word was carefully chosen, a polished stone dropped into the silent pool of the room, the ripples of its meaning expanding outward, touching her, chilling her. Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against her ribs. She knew what this was. Every ambitious woman knew this conversation, had heard whispers of it, had dreaded the day it would be her turn. "I assure you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her knuckles white as she gripped her glass, "my commitment to this company is unwavering." "I believe it is," he said softly, and the softness was more menacing than a shout. He took a step closer. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a mix of sandalwood and power. But loyalty, true loyalty, is a personal thing. It's about understanding needs before they are spoken. It's about a willingness to make sacrifices for the greater good, for the partnership. He reached out and placed a hand on the back of her chair, right next to her head. The gesture was proprietary. In closing, "The door to the vice president's office is very heavy, Eleanor. It's not a door one can simply push open, but it can be unlocked with the right key." He was so close now she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tick in his jaw. The proposition was laid bare between them, obscene in its unspoken clarity. Her mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of indignation, humiliation, and a terrifying pragmatic calculation. She could stand up, throw the scotch in his face, walk out and file a complaint that would go nowhere and brand her as a troublemaker, effectively ending her career at this level. Or she could play the game. The drive home to the suburbs felt like a journey to another planet. The gleaming steel towers of Manhattan receded in her rearview mirror, replaced by the gentle, tree-lined streets of Westchester. Each traffic light, each mile marker, felt like a step away from the predator's den and toward the gilded cage of her domestic life. She walked into her perfectly kept colonial home to the smell of roasted chicken. Mark, her husband, was in the kitchen, humming along to an indie rock station. He was a good man, a kind man, with a gentle smile and an architect's steady hands. He kissed her cheek, his lips warm against her cold skin. "Hey, you're late," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. "Tough day?" She nodded, unable to form words. He took in her expression, the tension in her jaw. "Still no word on the promotion?" he asked, his voice full of sympathy. "It's okay, Elle. You're the best they've got. It'll happen. And if it doesn't, maybe it's for the best. You work too hard as at Island." His words meant to soothe felt like sandpaper on her raw ambition. He didn't understand. He couldn't. He was content with their quiet life, their weekend trips to farmers markets, their predictable, comfortable love. For her, it felt like a slow death. That night, lying in bed next to her sleeping husband, Eleanor stared into the darkness. She could hear the steady, reassuring rhythm of his breathing. It was the sound of safety, of a life without risk, without the thrilling, terrifying climb to the summit. But she didn't want safety. She wanted the view from the 50th floor. She thought of Arthur Sterling's words, the weight of his hand near her head, the unspoken contract hanging in the air. A cold resolve settled over her, chilling her to the bone, extinguishing the last flicker of protest in her soul. She had been playing chess, and he had just shown her that it was a game with a different set of rules for players like her. Fine. If this was the price of ambition, if this was the key that unlocked the door, then she would pay it. She would take the key, and she would walk through that door, and she would never, ever look back. The decision, once made, brought a strange and terrible peace. The invitation arrived in a heavy, cream-colored envelope, the Sterling family crest embossed in gold at the top. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. The annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala, a premier event on the New York social calendar. Eleanor knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't a corporate function, it was personal. It was Arthur bringing her into his world, a public unveiling of his new interest. It was a move on the chessboard, shifting her from a confidential asset to a public one, a beautiful, intelligent woman on the arm of the CEO, a warning to others, and a brand upon her. She spent a week searching for the perfect dress, settling on a column of midnight blue silk that clung to her body like a second skin. It was elegant, powerful, but undeniably sensual. The neckline was high, but the back was bare, a daring plunge to the small of her back. It was a dress that said she belonged in this world of wealth and power, but that she played by her own rules. As she stood before the mirror on the night of the gala, fastening a simple diamond earring, she felt a chill. She was dressing for battle, putting on a costume for a role she had chosen but was only just beginning to understand. The gala was being held at the Museum of Modern Art, the vast white spaces transformed into a glittering forest of champagne flutes and designer gowns. The air hummed with the low thrum of powerful conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the polite, predatory smiles of the city's elite. Arthur was waiting for her just inside the entrance. He looked regal in a custom tuxedo, his silver hair catching the light. When he saw her, his eyes did a slow, appreciative sweep of her body that made her feel both prized and pinned, like a butterfly under glass. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low purr. "Stunning." He took her arm, his grip firm, proprietary. "There are some people I want you to meet." For the next hour, she was paraded through the crowd, a silent partner to Arthur's monologue of power. He introduced her to senators, hedge fund managers, and old money matriarchs whose jewelry was worth more than her apartment. To them, she was simply Arthur's brilliant new marketing director, a title that he delivered with a subtle emphasis that implied so much more. She smiled, she shook hands, she murmured polite pleasantries, but she felt like a ghost, her true self entirely absent from the proceedings. She was a prop, an accessory designed to make the man on whose arm she stood look even more formidable. Needing a moment's reprieve from the suffocating performance, she excused herself from a circle of men discussing their latest yacht acquisitions. "I'm just going to admire the art," she said with a polite smile, gently extracting her arm from Arthur's grasp. She wandered away from the thrum of the main hall into a quieter gallery where the pieces for the night's charity auction were displayed. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Here, the conversations were hushed, the focus on the canvases and sculptures. She stopped in front of a large, abstract painting, a chaotic swirl of deep blues, blacks, and a startling, violent slash of crimson. It felt like a portrait of her own mind. "It's unsettling, isn't it?" a voice said beside her, soft and contemplative. She turned. A young man stood there, holding a glass of water, not champagne. He was tall and lean in a well-cut but slightly rumpled suit, his dark hair falling over his forehead. He wasn't looking at her, but at the painting, his head tilted in thought, but it was his eyes that caught her. They were a deep, thoughtful brown, and they held a quiet intensity that was entirely out of place in this glittering, superficial room. "It feels honest," Eleanor found herself replying, surprised at her own candor. He turned his gaze from the painting to her, and for the first time all night, She felt like someone was actually seeing her, not the dress, not her title, but the woman inside. Honest, he repeated, tasting the word. I like that. Most people here would just ask what it's projected to sell for. A small, wry smile touched his lips. I'm Julian. He offered a hand, his grip gentle, not possessive. Eleanor, she replied, taking it. His name didn't register at first. He was just Julian, a welcome island of stillness in a chaotic sea. What do you see? He asked, turning back to the canvas. The question was genuine. He wasn't testing her. He was curious. I see a storm, she said, her voice lower now, more intimate. A beautiful, perfect world on the surface, but just underneath, there's that. She gestured with her chin toward the slash of red, something that's about to break everything apart. Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an unnerving perception. You're not like the others here, he said finally. It wasn't a compliment or a pickup line, it was a simple statement of fact. Before she could respond, a familiar, imposing presence loomed beside them. There you are, Arthur's voice boomed, shattering the quiet intimacy of their bubble. The warmth in the air instantly evaporated. Arthur placed a heavy hand on Eleanor's bare back, a gesture of ownership for all to see. He glanced at Julian, and his expression tightened with a flicker of annoyance, the kind a king might show to a bothersome court jester. Julian, I see you're enjoying the art, as usual. Try not to scare away the donors. The condescension was thick in his voice. He then turned his full attention back to Eleanor, his smile returning. Eleanor, this is my son, Julian. He's a photographer, lives in a world of his own. The introduction was also a dismissal. My son, the name Sterling clicked into place in Eleanor's mind with the force of a slamming door. Julian Sterling. This sensitive, observant man was the son of the predator she had bound herself to. A wave of something unidentifiable disappointment, confusion, dread washed over her. Julian's wry smile had vanished. He looked from his father's hand on Eleanor's back to her face, and his perceptive eyes seemed to understand something in that single, loaded glance. The easy warmth was gone, replaced by a polite, formal mask. It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Vance, he said, his tone now cool, distant. The connection was severed. Arthur guided her away, his fingers pressing into her skin. Don't mind him, he murmured, his voice laced with disdain. He has his mother's temperament. Too much feeling, not enough ambition. The rest of the evening passed in a haze for Eleanor. She smiled and nodded, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and allowed Arthur to steer her from one powerful circle to another. But her mind wasn't there. It was back in the quiet gallery, replaying the conversation, the way Julian had looked at the painting, the way he had looked at her. In the back of the town car, on the way to her apartment, Arthur spoke of deals and influence, of the people they had met and how she had impressed them. She made the right noises in response, but his voice was just a drone in the background. She had entered the museum that night focused on one man, on the cold, hard currency of power and promotion that defined her relationship with Arthur Sterling. But she left haunted by the ghost of a different kind of encounter, a brief, startling moment of genuine human connection with his son. And as the car sped through the sleeping city, Eleanor had the terrifying premonition that the slash of crimson in the painting was no longer just a metaphor, it was her future. The week following the gala was a torment of indecision. The memory of Julian's kind, intelligent eyes was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, a dangerous distraction. It was a glimpse of a different path, a softer, more genuine world she knew she couldn't afford to explore. Ambition was a cold, sharp thing. It did not allow for such sentimental detours. The promotion hadn't been mentioned again. Arthur was waiting, testing her resolve, forcing her to be the one to escalate their unspoken negotiation. She understood the game. He wanted her to want it, to ask for it, to prove she was willing to do more than simply accept his advances. She had to be an active participant. Fine. She would not be a pawn waiting to be moved. She would be the one to advance the peace. On Wednesday afternoon, sitting in the sterile quiet of her office, she drafted the email. The wording was a work of art, a perfect blend of professional ambition and subtle invitation. She suggested a private dinner, away from the prying eyes of the office, to conduct a deep dive on the long-term strategic rollout of the Odyssey initiative. It was a plausible, even necessary meeting. But the final sentence was the true message. I believe a more private setting would allow for a more creative exchange of ideas. She hit send before she could lose her nerve. His reply came in under a minute. An excellent proposal. Friday, 8 o'clock, the Gramercy Grill, my reservation. Friday evening, she began to prepare. It was a ritual, methodical and deliberate, like a soldier arming for a decisive battle. Mark had wanted to see a movie, but she had invented a last-minute work crisis, a lie that slipped from her lips with practiced ease. The guilt was a dull ache, but she pushed it down, compartmentalizing it with all the other inconvenient emotions. In the walk-in closet of their master bedroom, she bypassed her usual professional attire. Tonight's uniform was different. It started with the lingerie. She had bought it that afternoon, a secret purchase hidden in a plain shopping bag. It was a set of the finest French lace, the color of blood and wine. As she slipped it on, the delicate fabric felt impossibly soft against her skin, a secret fire no one could see. This wasn't for him, not really. It was for her. It was the physical embodiment of the line she was about to cross, a silent vow that she would not be a passive victim in this transaction. She was a willing conspirator in her own seduction. Next, the dress. It was the black silk one, a dress she had owned for years but had never dared to wear to a corporate function. It was deceptively simple, with long sleeves and a modest neckline, but it was cut on the bias, designed to drape and flow, clinging to every curve of her body as she moved. When she stood still, she looked elegant. When she walked, she looked like liquid sin. She sat at her vanity, the array of brushes and powders like a chemist's tools. Her makeup was a carefully constructed mask, a smoky eye to create an aura of mystery, a subtle contour to sharpen her cheekbones, and finally, the lips. She chose a bold, matte red lipstick, applying it with a surgeon's precision. The color was a statement, a focal point, a dare. Her hair she pinned up in a loose, elegant chignon, pulling a few delicate tendrils free to frame her face, an illusion of softness to counteract the severity of the red lips. The final touch was perfume. Not her usual light, floral scent, but something darker, with notes of amber and musk. It was a scent that lingered, that announced her presence before she even spoke. As she stood for a final inspection in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This was not Eleanor Vance, the diligent marketing director. This was a calculated creation, a weapon honed for a single purpose. She arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early, a small but significant power play. The Gramercy Grill was the kind of place where fortunes were made and secrets were buried in the velvet darkness of its private booths. She was led to a secluded corner table, the candlelight dancing on the crisp white linen. When Arthur arrived, he paused for a moment as he saw her, his usually unreadable expression giving way to a flicker of raw, undisguised admiration. It was the first victory of the evening. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a little thicker than usual as he slid into the booth opposite her, "you look exceptional." The dinner was a masterclass in subtext. They spoke of business, but the words were layered with double meanings. When he talked about an aggressive growth strategy, his eyes roamed over her face, her neck, the curve of her shoulder. When she spoke of taking calculated risks for a high reward, her fingers lightly traced the stem of her wine glass, her red nails a stark contrast against the crystal. The conversation was the foreplay, a verbal dance of escalating intimacy. She leaned forward to make a point, allowing the fabric of her dress to pull taut across her chest. Her hand brushed his on the table as she reached for a piece of bread, a touch that was both accidental and entirely deliberate. She laughed at one of his remarks, a low, throaty sound, and as she did, she met his gaze and held it for 1, 2, 3 beats longer than necessary. Under the table, out of sight, her silk-clad knee gently grazed his leg. He didn't flinch or pull away. The food was exquisite, the wine was perfect, but Eleanor barely tasted any of it. Her senses were entirely focused on the man across from her, on the subtle shifts in his breathing, the way his pupils dilated when she licked a drop of wine from her lip. She was in complete control, guiding the evening towards its inevitable conclusion. As the waiter cleared their dessert plates, a comfortable silence fell between them, thick with unspoken anticipation. The game of words was over. "This has been an illuminating evening, Eleanor," Arthur said finally, his voice a low, intimate growl. But I feel our strategic discussion is only just beginning. There are nuances, details, that are not best suited for a public place. He leaned forward, his cologne filling the small space between them. My penthouse is just a few blocks from here. It's quiet, private. We could explore those creative ideas you mentioned. This was it, the precipice. For a fleeting, treacherous moment, the image of Julian's face flashed in her mind, his honest smile, the kindness in his eyes. It was a pang of grief for a path not taken. She ruthlessly crushed it. That path did not lead to the 48th floor. She looked directly at Arthur, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across her red lips. I think, she said, her voice a silken whisper, that's an excellent idea. As he stood and placed his hand on the small of her back to guide her from the booth, the touch was no longer a question. It was a statement. The first move was complete. She had not only accepted the game, she had become a master of it. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a glass box climbing the spine of the skyscraper. Eleanor could feel the pressure changing in her ears, a physical manifestation of the altitude and the moment's crushing weight. Arthur stood beside her, not touching her, but his presence filled the small space, charged and kinetic. The doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into the penthouse itself. The first thing that hit her was the view. The city, her city, was laid out before her, a breathtaking, infinite tapestry of light and darkness, utterly silent through the thick panes of glass. The apartment was a study in masculine minimalism, vast open spaces, low-slung Italian leather sofas, polished concrete floors, and a collection of stark, imposing modern art. It wasn't a home, it was a monument to power, a billionaire's watchtower. It was designed to make a person feel small, and as the elevator doors slid shut behind her with a soft, final thud, Eleanor felt very small indeed. He moved to the bar without a word, the clinking of a heavy crystal decanter against a glass, the only sound in the cavernous room. He poured 2 more scotches, the amber liquid catching the light. He held one out to her, and as she took it, their fingers brushed. This time, she didn't pull away. She forced herself to meet his gaze. The predatory glint she'd seen at the restaurant was now fully unmasked, raw and direct. The pretense of business, of conversation, had been left behind in the velvet booth. He didn't drink. He placed his glass on the bar and stepped towards her, taking her drink from her hand and setting it aside with a deliberate, final click. He raised a hand, his knuckles lightly grazing her jawline, a touch that was both an assessment and a claim. Her entire body went rigid. This was the moment. Her mind screamed 1,000 silent protests. What are you doing? Turn around. Walk out that door. You are better than this. The voice of her ambition, cold and clear, answered back. This is the only way. This is the price. His kiss was not gentle. It was demanding, hungry. The kiss of a man who had waited long enough and was now simply taking what he believed was his. It tasted of whiskey and victory. For a moment, she was just a statue in his arms, unresponsive, her lips cold against his. He seemed to notice, pulling back slightly, his eyes narrowing. It was a test, and she knew she had to pass. With a will of iron, Eleanor forced the tension from her shoulders. She silenced the screaming in her head. She raised her arms, twining them around his neck, and kissed him back. It was a pure act of performance, a lie told with her body. He smiled against her lips, a victor's smile, and led her from the living area toward the bedroom. The room was dominated by a massive bed and another wall of glass overlooking the sleeping city. With an impatient tug, he pulled down the zipper of her black silk dress. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. The dress slithered from her body and pooled at her feet in a dark puddle. She stood before him in the red lace, her secret armor now revealed. His eyes darkened with appreciation, the look of a connoisseur examining a new, priceless acquisition. Beautiful, he rasped, his voice thick with desire. He pushed her gently but firmly towards the bed. The silk sheets were cool against her heated skin. He came down over her, his weight a heavy, inescapable reality. This was it, the final seal on their pact. A tremor of panic, a last-ditch protest from some buried part of her soul, made her whisper, "Arthur, wait." She placed a hand on his chest, a gesture of resistance, so feeble she knew it was pointless. He simply captured her wrist, his grip like steel, and moved her hand away, pinning it softly to the bed beside her head. It wasn't violent, but it was absolute. He was in control, and in that moment, Eleanor let go. She retreated deep inside her own mind, becoming a spectator to her own violation. She disassociated, watching the scene as if from the ceiling. She focused on the details, the precise grid of the recessed lighting above, the faint, rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation, the way the headlights of a single, distant taxi crawled along a deserted avenue below. She was an actress, and this was her most challenging role. His hands were on her, on the red lace, tearing it slightly in his haste. His mouth was on her skin, and she began her performance. The sounds she made were carefully calibrated, copied from movies, from a distant memory of what real passion sounded like. A soft gasp here, a low moan there. When he entered her, she arched her back, a perfect imitation of ecstasy. Her mind, however, was a block of ice. This is for the promotion. This is for the 48th floor. This is what it takes to win. His movements were rough, efficient, focused entirely on his own pleasure. She whispered his name, as the script demanded. Arthur, oh, Arthur. The words were breathy, convincing, but inside her head they were just syllables, meaningless sounds designed to bring the transaction to its swift conclusion. She felt the climax building in him, and she matched her performance to it, her feigned cries growing more intense, her body moving in a practiced rhythm beneath him. When it was over, he collapsed beside her with a shuddering groan. The connection, which had never really been there, was instantly, brutally severed. He didn't speak. He didn't hold her. Within minutes, the sound of his breathing deepened into the slow, heavy rhythm of sleep. Eleanor lay perfectly still, staring into the darkness, her body aching, a sticky film of sweat cooling on her skin. She didn't feel shame. She didn't feel regret. She felt empty. A vast, hollowed-out cavern where a part of her soul used to be, but beneath the emptiness there was a sliver of something else, something hard and cold and triumphant. The deal was done. Her end of the bargain had been met. Silently, she slipped out of the bed. In the pale moonlight filtering through the window, she gathered the pieces of her torn lingerie and the silk dress from the floor. She dressed quickly, her movements efficient and quiet. She didn't look back at the man sleeping in the bed. He was no longer a person. He was a stepping stone she had just crossed. As she rode the elevator down alone, she caught her reflection in the polished bronze walls. Her makeup was smeared. Her hair was a mess. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. But they were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a survivor, of a predator who had just made a necessary kill. The transaction was complete. The following days were a study in numbness. Eleanor moved through her life like a phantom, her body present but her spirit hovering somewhere outside of it. The promotion was officially announced on Monday morning. Her new office on the 48th floor was exactly as she had imagined. Spacious, modern, with a view that swallowed the horizon. Her colleagues offered congratulations that were a mixture of genuine admiration and thinly veiled envy. Her husband, Mark, was ecstatic, opening a bottle of champagne that tasted like ash in her mouth. She had won. The prize was hers, but every time she sat in her new leather chair and looked out at the city below, she didn't feel triumph. She felt the ghost of Arthur's weight on top of her, the memory of the cool silk sheets against her skin. It was a victory that felt exactly like a defeat. She felt used, but worse, she felt cheapened, as though she had willingly sold the most valuable part of herself for a corner office and a bigger salary. The feeling became a physical presence, a film on her skin that no amount of scrubbing in the shower could wash away. By Saturday, she couldn't stand it anymore. The forced cheerfulness of a weekend at home with Mark, his talk of gardening and brunch plans, felt like a pressure cooker on her soul. She needed to escape. She needed air. She told him she had to pick up some research materials from the library, a flimsy excuse he accepted without question, but she didn't drive to the library. The car seemed to steer itself, navigating the familiar streets of Manhattan until she found herself standing once again on the steps of the Museum of Modern Art. She didn't know why she had come. Perhaps she was subconsciously drawn back to the last place she had felt a flicker of something real, a brief moment of genuine connection before the transaction had been completed. The museum was different on a weekend morning. It was quiet, filled with families and art students, the air thick with contemplation instead of champagne and ambition. She wandered through the galleries, letting the colors and shapes wash over her, seeking anonymity in the crowd. She felt like a ghost haunting the scene of a crime. The gala, a distant, sordid memory. She was standing in the sculpture garden, staring at a massive, twisted piece of bronze that looked both powerful and tortured, when she heard his voice. "It looks how I feel most Mondays," she turned. Julian Sterling was standing a few feet away, a sketchbook in one hand, a ghost of a smile on his face. He was dressed in worn jeans and a simple gray sweater, looking more like a student than the son of a billionaire. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "Julian," she said, her own voice sounding rusty, unused. "What are you doing here?" "It's my church," he answered simply, gesturing vaguely at the art around them. "When the world gets too loud, I come here to listen." He looked at her then, his gaze gentle but deeply perceptive, and she had the sudden, terrifying feeling that he could see right through the carefully constructed facade she presented to the world. He could see the hollowness inside her. "You seem a million miles away, Eleanor," he said softly. There was no judgment in his voice, only quiet observation. He didn't mention his father, he didn't mention the gala, he simply changed the subject, nodding toward the sculpture. "My father hates this piece," he said with a wry grin. "He says it's a terrible investment. I think he's afraid of it. It's too honest. It doesn't hide its own brokenness." His words struck a chord deep within her. She, who had spent the last week hiding her own brokenness behind a new title and a bigger paycheck, he suggested coffee, and she found herself agreeing without hesitation. They sat at a small table in the museum's sunlit cafe, the quiet murmur of conversations around them, a comfortable blanket. For the first time, the conversation wasn't a chess match. He asked her about herself, not about her job at Sterling Corp., but about where she grew up, what she had studied in college, what she had wanted to be before ambition had become the singular, driving force in her life. The questions were so disarmingly simple, so profoundly personal, that they broke through her defenses. She told him about her love for classic literature, a passion she hadn't indulged in years. She talked about wanting to be a writer, a dream she had dismissed as impractical and childish a long, long time ago. He listened. It was a kind of listening she hadn't experienced in ages. He wasn't waiting for his turn to talk. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply present. He absorbed her words, his brown eyes full of an empathy that felt like a warm balm on her bruised soul. He in turn spoke about his photography. He talked about his fascination with capturing candid moments, the tiny, unguarded truths that people reveal when they don't think anyone is watching. He spoke of beauty and decay, of the stories told by a crack in the pavement or the fading paint on a wall. He spoke of a world that was the complete antithesis of his father's universe of polished surfaces and profitable lies. As she sat there, across from this gentle, thoughtful man, a new and terrifying feeling began to stir within her. It wasn't the cold, calculated desire she had manufactured for Arthur. It had nothing to do with power or gain. It was a deep, aching longing. She wasn't lusting after his body. She was craving his essence. She was starved for the kindness in his eyes, for the quiet safety of his presence, for the way he looked at her as if she were a person of infinite depth and not just a beautiful object to be acquired. It was a desire to be seen, to be understood, to be saved from the woman she was becoming. It was a far more dangerous desire than simple lust. Lust could be managed, controlled, used as a tool. This feeling was a wildfire, and it threatened to burn down the entire, carefully constructed edifice of her life. They talked for 2 hours, and it felt like 10 minutes. When they finally stood to leave, a new, unspoken intimacy hung in the air between them. "I'm glad I ran into you, Eleanor," he said, his smile genuine. "I hope I see you here again." It was a simple statement, yet it felt like a lifeline. He didn't ask for her number. He didn't try to push for more. He just left the door open, a quiet invitation to a world she thought she had locked herself out of forever. Driving home, the numbness was gone. In its place was a terrifying, vibrant warmth that spread through her chest. She had gone to the museum to cleanse herself of a physical transaction, to escape the feeling of being used by Arthur Sterling. Instead, she had stumbled headfirst into a connection that felt infinitely more real and infinitely more perilous. The deal with Arthur had cost her a piece of her soul. She had a sinking feeling that a relationship with Julian, however innocent, could cost her everything else. A new, precarious rhythm began to define Eleanor's existence. Her life fractured into three distinct, non-overlapping realities, each with its own wardrobe, its own vocabulary, its own version of her. There was the life of Eleanor Vance, the powerful, impeccably tailored vice president of Sterling Corp., a woman of spreadsheets and authority who commanded respect in the boardroom. There was the life lived with Mark in their quiet suburban home, a life of comfortable lies and growing distance, of feigned interest in weekend errands and home renovations. And then there were the secret lives, the two poles of her fragmented soul. Wednesday nights belonged to Arthur. This was a non-negotiable part of their arrangement, the maintenance fee on her career. The ritual was always the same. It would begin with a late-night meeting in her new office, the door closed, discussing strategy while the city lights twinkled outside. The conversation was a thin veneer, and eventually, he would push his chair back and say, "Let's continue this at my place." At his penthouse, she would transform. Off would come the corporate suit, and on would go the performance. She had a drawer at home filled with expensive, weaponized lingerie, black silk, crimson lace, pieces of armor designed to please his eye. The sex was a loveless, efficient script. She knew the lines, the sounds he wanted to hear, the way he liked her to move. She would perform her part with the detached precision of a seasoned actress, her mind a million miles away, cataloging market projections or replaying a gentle conversation she'd had with his son. Afterward, she would dress in the darkness and take a taxi back to a life he knew nothing about, feeling like a ghost returning to a grave. Then there were the stolen hours that belonged to Julian. These were the moments she truly lived for, the moments she could breathe. They met in secret, in places where they were unlikely to be seen: a dusty independent bookstore in the village, a quiet corner of the Brooklyn Museum, a windswept promenade overlooking the East River. With Julian, she shed the armor. She wore soft sweaters and jeans, her makeup was minimal, her hair was left down. She was not a vice president or a seductress. She was just Eleanor. Their time together was an oasis of authenticity in her desert of lies. They never spoke of his father, as if by silent agreement, that topic was a toxic territory neither wished to enter. Instead, they talked about everything else. They argued about films, shared childhood memories, and debated the meaning of art. He would show her his latest photographs, and she would see the world through his empathetic eyes. He made her laugh, a real, deep from the belly laugh that felt like a forgotten language. It was with Julian that she felt the slow, terrifying return of the woman she used to be, the one who loved books and dreamed of a life measured in meaning, not in promotions. The contrast between her two secret lives was a constant, brutal whiplash. With Arthur, she was an object of desire, her body a currency in a cold transaction. With Julian, she was the subject of her own life, her thoughts and feelings the only currency that mattered. The strain of this duplicity began to erode the foundations of her life with Mark. The lies became more frequent, more elaborate. A late night with Arthur became a strategy session that ran over. A stolen afternoon with Julian was a networking lunch with a new client. Mark, in his gentle, unsuspecting way, tried to bridge the growing chasm between them. He'd plan romantic dinners that she was too emotionally exhausted to enjoy. He'd try to draw her into conversation about their future, about children, a topic that now made her skin crawl, with the hypocrisy of it all. One evening, he came up behind her while she was washing dishes, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You feel a million miles away lately, Elle," he whispered into her hair. The simple, loving gesture felt like a brand, a mark of her betrayal. She tensed, unable to relax into his embrace. "I'm just stressed," she lied, the words tasting like poison. The new role is a lot of pressure. The lie, like all the others, was a brick in the wall she was building between them. The psychological toll was immense. She started having trouble sleeping. At night, she'd lie awake, trapped between the man she was deceiving and the ghosts of the two men who were tearing her life apart. One afternoon, after a particularly soulless night with Arthur, She was getting ready for work, staring at her own reflection in the bathroom mirror. For a long moment, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. She saw the cool, calculating eyes of the executive. She saw the faint bruise on her neck, artfully concealed with makeup, a souvenir from Arthur's impatience. And she saw, deep within her own pupils, the desperate, longing sadness of a woman falling in love with the one person in the world she could never have. Who was she? Was she the woman in the power suit, the woman in the lace teddy, the woman in the soft sweater, or the woman with the wedding ring? The truth was, she was all of them, a fractured mosaic of identities, and she feared that soon the pieces would no longer hold together. The breaking point felt terrifyingly close. The need to see Julian became a desperate addiction, the only antidote to the poison of her arrangement with his father. She started taking bigger risks. One sunny autumn Tuesday, she canceled a critical budget meeting, feigning a sudden migraine, just to spend an hour with him on a bench in Central Park. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the leaves fall, and she felt a sense of peace that was so profound it made her want to weep. As they were leaving, strolling towards the park exit, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "Hope you're feeling better. I'm near your office. Was thinking of surprising you for lunch." Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She was miles from her office. She was with the wrong man. "I have to go," she said abruptly to Julian, her voice tight with fear. She didn't offer an explanation, just turned and practically ran, leaving him standing there, a confused and hurt expression on his face. She managed to intercept Mark with a series of frantic texts, telling him her migraine was worse and she was already in a taxi home. The lie worked, but the close call left her trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs for hours. As she sat in the back of the cab, the city blurring past the window, she finally admitted the truth to herself. This wasn't a sustainable life. It was a house of cards in a hurricane, and the wind was picking up. The days that followed the frantic escape from Central Park were pure agony. Eleanor's mind played the scene on a loop, the sudden cold panic in her veins, and worse, the look of bewildered hurt on Julian's face as she had fled without a word. She had treated him like an inconvenience, an obstacle in the path of her complex web of lies, when in truth, he was the only part of her life that felt real. The guilt was a different species from the kind she felt with Mark. It was sharper, more acute, because it was a betrayal of the one genuine connection she had. She knew she couldn't leave it like that. She had to see him, to try and mend the tear in the delicate fabric of their friendship, even if it meant weaving a more intricate lie to do it. She texted him, her fingers trembling slightly. "I owe you an apology, a real one. Could we take a walk? The High Line, maybe?" His reply was almost immediate. "Of course. Tomorrow at sunset?" The High Line was a ribbon of curated wilderness woven through the steel and brick of the city, a perfect metaphor for the strange, beautiful thing growing between them in the middle of her concrete life. As she waited for him near the Gansevoort Street entrance, her stomach was a knot of anxiety. When he appeared, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, the tension was palpable. He looked tired, and there were shadows under his eyes. They began to walk, the silence between them punctuated by the distant sounds of traffic below. "Julian, about the other day," she began, her voice unsteady. "I am so sorry. It was unprofessional and rude of me. Something came up, a work emergency. It was critical." The lie felt flimsy and inadequate, even to her own ears. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the Hudson River glinting in the distance. "It's fine, Eleanor," he said, but his voice was flat. "You don't owe me an explanation. We're just friends grabbing coffee." The words "just friends" landed like stones in her chest. They walked further, finding a secluded bench overlooking the river, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it felt painful, a backdrop too romantic for the conversation she was trying to have. He finally turned to face her, his expression serious, his eyes searching hers. "Can I be honest?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her heart beginning to pound. "I don't think we're just friends," he said softly. "And I don't think that was a work emergency." He held up a hand to stop her protest. "It's not my business. I know that. I know your life is complicated. You wear a wedding ring, Eleanor. I see it. But I also see you. He leaned forward slightly, his earnestness a magnetic force. "From the first moment I saw you at that ridiculous gala, I saw it. You were wearing this perfect, beautiful armor, but your eyes were so sad. It's like you're a prisoner in your own life, and you're fighting this silent, lonely war, and I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about you." Every word was a key, turning a lock deep inside her. He saw her. He didn't just see the polished executive or the beautiful woman. He saw the sadness, the fight, the prisoner. He saw the truth she tried so desperately to conceal from the world and from herself. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and treacherous. All the ambition, all the calculation, all the cold, hard resolve that had carried her this far simply dissolved under the warmth of his gaze. She had been so strong for so long, and she was suddenly devastatingly tired of fighting alone. "Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking, but she had no words to follow. What could she say? He reached out then, not with the possessive confidence of his father, but with a hesitant tenderness that was infinitely more powerful. His fingers gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated feeling that shot through her entire body. It was a question, a permission slip, a point of no return, and she gave him the answer. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was a complete and total surrender. It was all the encouragement he needed. He leaned in and kissed her. It started as a soft, tentative press of his lips against hers, a moment of profound and gentle discovery. It was nothing like Arthur's bruising, selfish kisses. This was a conversation. It was a shared breath, a mutual sigh of relief. And as she responded, her lips parting under his, the kiss deepened, becoming a desperate, hungry expression of all the unspoken words, all the pent-up longing that had been crackling between them for weeks. It wasn't a transaction, it was a communion. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't performing. She was feeling. Every nerve ending in her body was on fire, not with manufactured passion, but with a terrifying, overwhelming wave of pure emotion. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, the world around them seeming to fade into a soft, indistinct blur. The sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the sky into a deep, velvety twilight. The unspoken had become undeniable. It hung in the air between them, shimmering and dangerous. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of desire and fear, as if he couldn't quite believe what they had just done. But Eleanor saw it with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that stole the air from her lungs. She looked at this kind, soulful, beautiful man, his father's son, and the truth crashed down upon her. This wasn't a flirtation. This wasn't an escape from the pressures of her life. This wasn't a temporary balm for her loneliness. She was in love with him. The realization was not joyful, it was terrifying. Her arrangement with Arthur was a sin of ambition, a cold, calculated crime against her marriage. But this was a sin of the heart. It was a betrayal, born not of cynicism, but of love. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it was 1,000 times more profound and would be 1,000,000 times more destructive. That kiss on the High Line had shattered the world. The carefully constructed compartments of Eleanor's life had been breached, their contents spilling into one another in a chaotic, emotional flood. There was no going back to their quiet, intellectual friendship. The forbidden had been spoken, and its echo was deafening. 2 days later, a text from Julian lit up her phone, a simple message that felt like a destiny. "Come to my studio. I want to show you my darkroom, where the real magic happens." It was an invitation past the final gate, into the core of his world, and she knew its true meaning. Her mind screamed a chorus of warnings. This was the final, irrevocable betrayal. This was the step from which there was no return. She thought of Mark's trusting face. She thought of the cold, possessive fury of Arthur if he were to ever find out. But then she thought of Julian's kiss, of the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in years, and the warnings faded into a faint, distant hum. The pull was too strong. It was gravity. This time, as she prepared, there was no calculation, there was no armor. She stood before her closet and chose a simple, soft blue dress, the color of a summer sky. At her lingerie drawer, her hand moved past the aggressive reds and blacks she reserved for Arthur. She chose a delicate, comfortable set of pale blue lace, a secret she wore only for herself. It was an unconscious choice, a desire to be wholly and authentically Eleanor, with no artifice, no performance. She was not going into a negotiation. She was walking toward a surrender. His studio was in a converted warehouse in Dumbo, the kind of space that felt more alive than any pristine penthouse. The moment she stepped inside, she was enveloped by his world. The vast room was flooded with the soft, hazy light of late afternoon pouring through enormous industrial windows. The air smelled of coffee and photographic chemicals. Stacks of art books and novels created precarious towers on the floor, and the walls were covered in his soul. Dozens of black and white photographs were tacked up, a sprawling, chaotic gallery of his work. There were haunting cityscapes, intimate portraits of strangers whose faces told entire life stories, and abstract images that found beauty in decay. It was a space that was messy, honest, and breathtakingly beautiful. It was him. "Welcome," he said softly, his smile a little shy, as if he were nervous to let her into this private space. He gave her a tour, his voice filled with a quiet passion as he explained his process, how he developed his own film, the stories behind the faces on the walls. She watched him, mesmerized as he spoke. She was falling in love not just with the man, but with the world he had created, a world built on truth and empathy. The physical space between them began to shrink, the air growing thick with unspoken anticipation. He led her to a small, warmly lit area with a worn leather armchair and a single powerful portrait on the wall. An elderly woman, her face a roadmap of joy and sorrow. "This is my favorite," he said. Her name was Elena. "I met her in the park. She told me she had loved the same man for 60 years. As he spoke, he turned to look at her, and the conversation about the photograph faded away, replaced by the silent, overwhelming conversation happening in their eyes. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her skin. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The sound of her own name, spoken with such reverence, was her undoing. He kissed her then, and it was a continuation of their kiss on the High Line, but with a new, desperate intensity. It was the kiss of two people who had found each other against impossible odds and knew their time might be short. He led her by the hand to the back of the loft, where a simple bed was tucked into a quiet alcove. There was no rush, no impatience. It was a slow, deliberate pilgrimage. He unbuttoned her dress with hands that trembled slightly, his gaze locked on hers, as if asking for permission with every touch. When the dress slipped from her shoulders, revealing the simple blue lace beneath, his expression was not one of conquest, but of awe. He traced the edge of the lace with one finger, a touch so tender it made her want to weep. "You're real," he murmured, as if to himself. And as he undressed her, as he undressed himself, she felt herself shedding more than just her clothes. She was shedding the lies, the ambition, the cynicism, the hard shell she had built around her heart. Lying with him on his bed, the golden light streaming through the window, she was more naked than she had ever been in her life. This was not a performance. This was a revelation. Every touch was a discovery, every kiss a confession. Where Arthur's hands had been instruments of possession, Julian's were instruments of worship. He explored her body with a slow, reverent curiosity, as if he were trying to learn the language of her soul through her skin. For the first time, she wasn't a spectator in her own body. She was present, alive, every nerve ending singing. The sounds that escaped her lips were not calculated or feigned. They were involuntary, a pure, unvarnished expression of pleasure and emotional release. "Julian, oh God, yes," she gasped, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Please, don't stop." It was a plea born of a lifetime of being starved for this kind of tenderness, this kind of connection. It was a release of all the pain, the loneliness, the feeling of being unseen. He moved with her. For her, their bodies creating a rhythm of desperate, beautiful, heartbreaking passion. Afterward, there was no silence. There was no rolling away. He gathered her into his arms, pulling the sheets over them, and held her as if he would never let her go. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, the tear that slipped from the corner of her eye. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of peace, full of sorrow, full of the terrifying weight of what they had just done. They lay like that for what felt like hours, entangled and still, as the afternoon sun bled into the soft purple of twilight and the city outside began to glitter to life. Lying there in his arms, in the quiet sanctuary of his studio, Eleanor felt the last of her internal defenses crumble into dust. The war was over. She had surrendered completely. She looked at his face, peaceful in the fading light, and a devastatingly clear thought rose in her mind. She would burn her entire world to the ground, watch the ashes of her life swirl around her feet, if it meant she could stay in this single, perfect, catastrophic moment forever. The surrender to Julian was not a release. It was a rewiring of Eleanor's entire being. Her world, once governed by the cold, hard logic of ambition, was now ruled by the chaotic, desperate tides of a forbidden love. She became an addict, and Julian was her drug. Every stolen hour with him was a breath of pure oxygen in the suffocating atmosphere of her life, and it only made the toxic air of her other realities more poisonous. The change manifested most dangerously in her Wednesdays with Arthur. The transaction, once a bearable, if unpleasant, price to pay, now felt like a grotesque violation. Her performance, once flawless, became strained. Her body might be in his penthouse, but her soul was in a sunlit loft in Dumbo. Arthur, a man whose empire was built on his ability to detect the slightest shift in a person's loyalty, noticed immediately. He was a predator, and he could sense that his prey's attention was no longer solely on him. "You're distracted," he said one night, pulling away from her in his bed, his voice laced with suspicion. She was lying beside him, staring at the city lights, her mind replaying a conversation with Julian about old Italian films. "Is the new position overwhelming you, Eleanor?" The question was a threat wrapped in concern. "Perhaps you're not ready for the pressure." His touch became rougher in the following weeks, his demands more frequent, as if he were trying to physically force the attentive, compliant woman he had bought and paid for to resurface. The calls started coming at odd hours, on weekends. "Just checking in," he'd say, but they both knew he was checking up on her. His questions became more pointed. "You were offline for 3 hours this afternoon. A long lunch?" Every inquiry was a tug on the leash, reminding her who held it. With Julian, the pressure was of a different, more heartbreaking kind. He was deeply in love and blind to the sordid mechanics of her life, but he was not blind to her. He saw the new, frantic anxiety that clung to her like a second skin. He saw the way she would flinch every time her phone buzzed, the way she would scan every restaurant and street corner as if expecting an attack. "Talk to me, Ellie," he would plead, his voice full of a gentle concern that was more painful than any accusation. "Whatever this is, whatever you're so afraid of, you don't have to carry it by yourself." His love, the very thing that was her salvation, became a source of profound, suffocating guilt. How could she look into his honest, loving eyes and tell him that the monster he was trying to save her from was his own father? How could she confess that their beautiful, pure connection was subsidized by a sordid arrangement with the man he despised? So she would deflect, offering vague assurances and manufactured smiles, and the secrets would sit between them, a poisonous, invisible wall. The cracks were showing at home too. Mark was no longer simply sad, he was suspicious. The wall of her lies had become too high, too impenetrable. The breaking point came over a credit card statement. He approached her one evening as she was getting ready for bed, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held the piece of paper. "There are charges here, Ellie," he said, his voice quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. 2 weeks ago, lunch for 2 at a cafe in Dumbo. You told me you were in meetings in Midtown all day. Last week, tickets to the Angelica Film Center. You said you were at a conference in New Jersey." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, wounded confusion. "Please, just tell me the truth. Whatever it is, we can fix it. But the lies are killing me." She looked at the man she had once promised to love and honor, and she opened her mouth to tell another, more elaborate lie. She spoke of networking with an eccentric artist for a new campaign, a story so convoluted and thin she could barely follow it herself. He didn't argue. He just watched her, and the last flicker of belief in his eyes died out. He turned and walked out of the room, and for the first time, he didn't sleep in their bed. The fracture in their marriage had become a full-blown schism. The universe, it seemed, had decided to stop sending warnings and start staging collisions. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Arthur, in a foul mood over a deal that had gone south, had summoned her to her own office for an impromptu debriefing. His presence filled the room, sucking the air out of it. He was angry about her perceived slights, her emotional distance, and he was using his power to intimidate her, to remind her of the precariousness of her position. He backed her against her desk, his voice a low growl as he spoke of loyalty and consequences. "You seem to have forgotten the terms of our partnership," he hissed, his face close to hers. He grabbed her, his kiss hard and punishing, a brutish reassertion of his ownership. In that moment of pure, blinding panic, Eleanor heard it. A voice, a cheerful, familiar voice in the outer office, speaking to her assistant. "Hey, is Eleanor free for a second? I was in the neighborhood and brought her a peace offering." It was Julian. Ice-cold terror shot through Eleanor's veins, a jolt so powerful it momentarily paralyzed her. Her heart stopped. His son was right outside the door. She shoved Arthur away with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Get off me," she whispered, her voice a strangled gasp. She frantically smoothed her dress and her hair, her mind a screaming white void. Arthur looked at her, then at the door, his expression shifting from anger to a dark, predatory curiosity. The doorknob began to turn. Eleanor lunged forward and pulled it open herself, trying to create the illusion of normalcy. Julian stood there, a warm, easy smile on his face, holding 2 cups of coffee. His smile faltered the instant he saw her. He took in her pale, panicked face, her slightly disheveled appearance. Then, his eyes moved past her, and he saw his father stepping out from the shadows of her office, his own face a thundercloud of fury. The silence in the room was absolute, a thick, unbreathable vacuum. The 3 of them stood frozen in a horrifying tableau. Julian's gaze flickered from his father's menacing presence to Eleanor's terrified one. The pieces began to click together in his mind, the secrecy, her constant anxiety, her presence at the gala, his father's strange possessiveness. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of dawning, sickening comprehension. Arthur broke the silence, his voice dripping with venom. "We are in the middle of a critical business meeting. Julian," he snapped, stepping forward to position himself possessively beside Eleanor. "Go play with your camera." Julian didn't move. He just stared at Eleanor, his eyes searching hers, begging for a denial, for any explanation that wasn't the monstrous one taking shape in his head. She couldn't speak, she couldn't breathe. All she could do was stand there as the 2 worlds she had fought so desperately to keep separate collided with catastrophic force right before her very eyes. The moments after Julian left the office were a vacuum of terrifying silence. Arthur stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. The predatory curiosity was gone, replaced by the chilling certainty of a man who had been betrayed and made a fool of. He looked at Eleanor, who was still standing frozen by her desk, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, precise, and they cut deeper than any shout could. "My penthouse," he said, his voice like chipping ice. 7 o'clock. "And Eleanor," he added, as he turned to leave, "tell my son to be there as well. It seems it's time for a long overdue family discussion. It was not a request, it was a death sentence." Eleanor spent the next few hours in a state of suspended dread. Calling Julian was the hardest thing she had ever had to do. His voice was wounded, confused. "What was that, Ellie? What is going on?" She couldn't explain. "He wants us both there tonight," she said, her own voice sounding hollow and distant. "Please, Julian, you have to come." There was a long, painful silence on the other end of the line before he finally agreed. She knew he was coming for her, hoping to protect her, still clinging to the desperate hope that there was a reasonable explanation for the horrifying scene he had witnessed. His loyalty was a knife twisting in her gut. She went home, showered, and changed like a condemned prisoner preparing for her own execution. She chose a simple black dress, the color of mourning. There would be no armor tonight, there was nothing left to protect. The penthouse, when she arrived, felt different. The breathtaking view of the city no longer seemed beautiful. It seemed mocking, a silent witness to her impending doom. The opulent space felt like a cold, sterile courtroom where she was to be the star defendant and there would be no jury. Julian was already there, standing stiffly by the window, looking out at the city, his back to the room. Arthur was seated in one of his large leather armchairs, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking every bit the ruthless monarch presiding over a trial. Eleanor. Punctual, as always, Arthur said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Please, have a seat. We have so much to discuss. Julian turned as she entered, and the look in his eyes was a mixture of deep concern and gnawing suspicion. He wanted to believe in her, but the evidence was damning. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to sit down. She stood in the middle of the room, feeling exposed under the weight of both men's stares. Arthur began, his tone deceptively calm. So, Julian, he started, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. You've been spending a great deal of time with Miss Vance, developing a sudden, passionate interest in marketing strategies, are we? Dad, stop it, Julian said, his voice tight. Whatever you think is happening, you're wrong. Eleanor is my friend. Your friend? Arthur let out a short, ugly laugh. Is that what she told you? And you, Eleanor, he said, turning his cold gaze on her. You have a talent for mentorship, it seems. Taking my son under your wing, showing him the ropes. Eleanor remained silent, her throat closing up, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run. Anything she said would only be used as fuel for the fire he was building. Her silence was her only refuge and her greatest condemnation. We talk about art, Julian insisted, his voice rising, a desperate edge to it now. We talk about films. It's not what you're making it out to be. Oh, I'm sure you talk about many things, Arthur sneered, finally rising from his chair. He began to pace slowly, like a shark circling its prey. But what I'm interested in, son, is what she doesn't tell you. He stopped in front of Eleanor, looking down at her with utter contempt. Does she tell you about our little chats? The ones we have up here on Wednesday nights? Julian's face went pale. What are you talking about? He whispered. This was the moment. This was the kill. Arthur turned to his son, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. You see, Julian, your friend is a very ambitious woman, and ambition has a price. Ask her. Ask her how she really earned that big, beautiful office on the 48th floor. He let the words hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. Julian stared at his father, then his gaze shifted to Eleanor, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. He was begging her, silently, to deny it, to say anything to make the monstrous insinuation go away. Eleanor opened her mouth, but no sound came out. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cold cheek. That was all the answer he needed. Arthur, seeing his victory, decided to twist the knife. She's a fine performer, he continued, his voice conversational, as if discussing a stock price. Very dedicated. She understands the importance of pleasing her superiors. She fulfilled her side of our bargain quite admirably. It's a shame she grew greedy. It seems my investment wasn't enough for her. The clinical, transactional way he described it was more brutal than any angry accusation. It stripped the last shred of dignity from the sordid affair, laying it bare as a simple purchase of flesh for a title. Julian made a choked, guttural sound in the back of his throat. He looked at Eleanor, and the love, the concern, the admiration that had been in his eyes for weeks was gone. In its place was something that shattered her heart into a million pieces, pure, undiluted revulsion. He looked at her as if he had never seen her before, as if she were something vile he had found crawling under a rock. Is it true? He finally asked, his voice barely a whisper, broken. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a tiny jerky movement of her head. It was an admission of everything. The lie of their connection, the depth of her betrayal. She had not only slept with his father, she had sold herself to him, and then she had taken Julian's pure, honest love and used it as a balm for her guilty conscience. The disgust on Julian's face intensified, and it was now directed as much at himself as it was at her. God, he breathed, turning away, running a hand through his hair. He looked back at his father, his expression now one of utter loathing. You are exactly the same. That was the final blow. To be equated with Arthur, to be seen as his counterpart in this ugly transactional world, was the ultimate damnation. Arthur had won. He had destroyed them both. "Well," he said, his voice returning to its usual brisk corporate tone, "I'm glad we've cleared the air." He looked at Eleanor, his face devoid of all emotion. "Your access to the building will be revoked in the morning. Have your things cleared out by noon. You're fired, of course." He then walked to his bar and poured himself another drink, his back to the wreckage he had created. The trial was over. Eleanor stood there for a moment longer, a ghost in the beautiful room where her ambition had led her to ruin. Julian wouldn't look at her. He just stared out the window, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She turned and walked out of the penthouse, her footsteps echoing in the terrible silence. The elevator doors slid shut, and as she descended, she didn't see a reflection of a powerful executive in the polished walls. She saw nothing at all. The elevator that descended from Arthur's penthouse carried a ghost. Eleanor walked out into the cold night air of the city, a hollow shell of the woman who had entered the building just an hour before. The glittering lights of the skyscrapers, the symbols of the ambition that had driven her entire adult life, now seemed like distant, indifferent stars in a cold, empty universe. She didn't take a cab. She walked. She walked for miles through the sleeping city, her simple black dress and thin coat, no match for the biting wind. But she didn't feel the cold. She felt nothing. The explosion in the penthouse had burned away everything, her pride, her love, her hope, leaving only the ashes of a life that was, for all intents and purposes, over. The dominoes fell with a swift, brutal efficiency in the days that followed. The first was her career. An email from Human Resources, clinical and impersonal, confirmed her immediate termination for breach of contract. Her corporate phone was deactivated. Her email account was erased. 12 years of tireless work, of a life sacrificed at the altar of Sterling Corp, vanished with a single keystroke. The beautiful office on the 48th floor, the prize for which she had sold her soul, was hers for less than a month. It was now just a room she was no longer allowed to enter. The next to fall was her marriage. There was no strength left in her for more lies. When she finally saw Mark, his face etched with a pain that was now mixed with a cold, hard certainty, she simply told him. Not everything, not the sordid details of the transaction or the heartbreaking truth about her love for Julian, but she told him enough. She told him there was someone else. She watched the last bit of love for her die in his eyes, replaced by the quiet, resolute grief of a good man who had been profoundly betrayed. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. His quietness was a judgment more damning than any tirade. He packed a bag that night, and 2 weeks later, the divorce papers arrived. The home they had built together, a symbol of a life of comfortable, predictable happiness she had once found so suffocating, was now just a collection of assets to be divided. And then there was Julian, the most profound loss, the one that truly broke her. She sent him one desperate text message a few days after the confrontation. "Julian, please, I know you hate me, but let me explain." She waited, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, staring at her phone for hours. The reply, when it finally came, was a single, devastating sentence. "There is nothing you could say that I would ever want to hear." She knew then that it was over. His disgust was absolute. The beautiful, tender connection she had felt in his arms, the only truly honest thing in her life of lies, had been irrevocably poisoned. She had not only lost his love, she had destroyed his ability to see the good in the world, and perhaps in himself. That was her greatest sin, which led to this. A month later, in the echoing silence of her empty apartment, the furniture was gone, sold. All that remained were cardboard boxes, monuments to a dismantled life. One was labeled kitchen, another books. A small open box near her feet contained the relics from her office, a framed diploma, a few industry awards, and a heavy silver nameplate, Eleanor Vance, Vice President. She picked it up, the metal cool and heavy in her hand. She had gotten it. She had held the prize. She looked at the meaningless title and felt a laugh, dry and humorless, bubble up in her throat. She moved to the window, looking down, not at a grand skyline, but at a simple, anonymous suburban street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers. She thought about the choices she had made. She had entered into a bargain with a powerful man, telling herself it was a strategic move, a necessary sacrifice for a greater goal. But the truth was more complicated. The real danger hadn't been Arthur's lust or his power. It had been her own emptiness. And into that void had stepped Julian, offering a kindness and a connection she was starving for. She had mistaken his love for a lifeline, when in reality, it was the very thing that ensured she would drown. She had wanted everything: the power and the passion, the corner office and the true love. And in grasping for it all, she was left with nothing. She stood there for a long time, the nameplate growing heavy in her hand, as the last of the daylight faded and the room plunged into darkness. The boxes were packed, her past sealed away. But as for the future, there was only a vast, terrifying emptiness. The question remained, a quiet, haunting whisper in the silent apartment. What do you do when you burn down your own life and find you have nowhere else to go?